"Give me a successor and disappear," Duke said after losing his son, and she made him pay for his words. The candles had burned low by the time Pedro Thornfield entered his new wife's chambers. Whitney had been waiting in the armchair by the window, not on the bed, a deliberate choice she had made without fully understanding why, dressed in the ivory nightgown her mother had pressed into her hands the morning of the wedding with an expression that contained an entire education. Outside, the grounds of Ravenscroft Manor stretched into darkness, endless and indifferent, the kind of landscape that reminded you how small a single person was inside it. She had been nervous. She would not pretend otherwise, even in the privacy of her own memory. But she had also been something else, open, in the way that a door is open, in the way that requires a choice from the person standing on the other side of it. Pedro had not made that choice. Before we continue, please subscribe, likes, comments, and follow, because tomorrow I have more story for you. He had entered with the contained precision of a man executing a task he had already mentally completed. He was still handsome in the candlelight, sharp-jawed, storm-eyed, the kind of face that looked as though it had been arranged by someone who understood structure but had never much cared for warmth. He had been perfectly correct throughout, controlled. And when it was finished, when Whitney lay still in the guttering dark, trying to locate herself inside the strange geography of what had just occurred, he had risen from the bed without hesitation. He dressed with his back to her. She watched him and said nothing. He moved toward the door, and she thought, she almost believed, that he would turn. That some instinct, some residual human impulse, would cause him to look back at the woman he had just made his wife. He did not turn. At the door, with his hand already on the frame, he spoke. For sentences, delivered to the middle distance, to the wood paneling, to no one in particular. "Give me a successor and disappear. That is all I require from this arrangement. You will want for nothing materially. I expect you to understand, this is not a negotiation." The door closed. The candle nearest to her guttered once and steadied. Whitney did not move for a long time. She lay in the enormous bed, in the enormous room, in the enormous house that was now, technically, hers, and she stared at the ceiling and let the words arrange themselves inside her, felt them find their edges, felt them settle into something permanent. She did not cry. She had considered it, assessed it, and decided against it the way one decides against an ill-fitting coat. It would change nothing. He was not in the room to see it, and she had never been in the habit of performing for an empty audience. What she did instead was make a decision. It arrived quietly, without fanfare, the way the most irrevocable things tend to. He will regret this. Not a threat, not even entirely a promise. Simply a fact she had identified, examined, and accepted, the way one accepts the weather, or the hour, or the particular shape of one's own life. She reached over and extinguished the last candle herself. She began on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday held any particular significance, but because Monday had been for observation, for walking the corridors of Ravenscroft Manor with her hands clasped and her eyes open, cataloging everything Pedro Thornfield assumed she would overlook. The east wing's failing roof drainage. The household accounts kept in a system that had not been updated since his father's time. The 3 members of staff who had clearly learned to function around their Duke rather than for him, filling silences he had never bothered to address. Whitney addressed them, quietly, specifically by name. On Tuesday morning she rose early, dressed without summoning her maid, and carried her correspondence box to the one room in Ravenscroft that she had identified, through 2 days of careful, unhurried attention, as the precise room Pedro would least expect her to enter. His private study. Before we continue, please subscribe, likes, comments, and follow, because tomorrow I have more story for you. It was a magnificent room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fireplace that actually drew properly unlike the one in her assigned sitting room, and a writing desk positioned before a south-facing window that received the morning light in a way that made every other desk in the manor feel like a deliberate punishment. She settled herself into the chair behind it, arranged her letters, and began to write. She had completed 3 pieces of correspondence before she heard his footsteps. Pedro appeared in the doorway at 8:30, already dressed, already armored in that particular stillness of his. He stopped when he saw her. She watched the moment of recalibration move across his face, small, controlled, but present. "This is my study." "I know." Whitney finished her sentence before looking up. "The light is exceptional. I've written to Lady Fenwick about the charitable committee, to your estate steward regarding the drainage issue on the north pasture boundary, and to the linen supplier in London, who has apparently been overcharging Ravenscroft for 14 months. She set down her pen with the unhurried precision of someone completing a task rather than defending a position. "I hope you don't mind." The silence that followed was the specific kind that meant he minded very much. "There's a sitting room allocated to you in the East Wing." His voice was even, controlled. She was beginning to understand that his control was not composure, it was effort. "There is." She agreed pleasantly. "It faces north. In winter, I imagine it becomes quite uninhabitable by mid-morning." She folded her first letter. "I'll be finished within the hour. The desk will be exactly as I found it." He looked at her for a long moment, those storm-colored eyes doing the thing they did, that careful, almost reluctant assessment, as though she were a problem he had not accounted for in his original calculations. She met his gaze with perfect calm and reached for her next sheet of paper. Whatever he had expected her to be, she noted with quiet satisfaction, it had not been this. He left without another word. Whitney allowed herself one small, private smile and continued writing. She wore midnight blue. It was a deliberate choice, not the pale, self-effacing colors a new duchess might select to signal deference, but something with weight and intention. A gown that announced its wearer had considered the room before entering it. Whitney had learned that lesson early. Appearance was vocabulary, and she had always been precise with her words. The Ravenscroft autumn dinner seated 42. She had memorized every name on the guest list before the first carriage arrived. Pedro stood at her side during the receiving line, with the practiced courtesy of a man who had performed this ritual many times and found it marginally preferable to the alternatives. He made introductions in the correct order, said the correct things, and maintained the correct distance from their guests, from her, from anything that might require him to be present in any sense beyond the physical. Whitney smiled at every face as though it were the one she had most hoped to see. By the time they moved to the dining room, she had already placed 3 names in her memory alongside the particular details each person had offered without realizing it: Lord Fenwick's anxious pride in his youngest son, Lady Hartwell's genuine passion for agricultural reform, old Sir Edmund Crane's loneliness, evident in how long he held each handshake. She stored them carefully. People remembered those who remembered them. That was not manipulation, it was attention, and attention, she had found, was the rarest currency in rooms like this one. She commanded the table from the Duchess's end without raising her voice once. She hadn't intended to watch Pedro. But somewhere between the second and third course, she became aware that he was watching her from his end of the long table, over the candelabra and the crystal, with an expression she couldn't entirely read across the distance. Not displeasure. Something more unsettled than that. The look of a man encountering something that had declined to behave according to his expectations. Good, she thought, and turned back to Lord Fenwick with a question about his north pasture yields. Lady Serena Ashby arrived after dinner, during the drawing-room hour, in the manner of someone accustomed to making entrances. She was beautiful in the architectural sense, everything precisely placed, nothing accidental, and she moved through the room with the confidence of a woman who considered it already hers. She found Whitney within minutes. "Your Grace." The smile was exquisite. "What a triumph you've managed. Ravenscroft hasn't hosted a dinner of this warmth in years." A brief, expert pause. Of course, it was always the house that needed a woman's hand. The Duke never quite well. Some men are better suited to solitude, aren't they? Whitney held her gaze with an expression of polite interest. "And some women," she replied, "are better suited to honesty than implication. But we work with our natures, I suppose." She moved away before the silence could sharpen into confrontation, leaving Serena Ashby holding a smile that had nowhere left to go. Across the room, she felt Pedro's eyes follow her still. She found it by accident. She had been conducting her Thursday inventory of the manor's west corridor, a habit Pedro had not sanctioned and could not reasonably forbid, when she noticed the door. It sat between two large ancestral portraits, recessed slightly into the wall, the kind of door designed to be overlooked. She might have overlooked it herself, except that someone had recently oiled its hinges. Everything else on this corridor had the comfortable neglect of long disuse. This door had been tended. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stood in the frame for a moment, understanding arriving quietly before she had words for it. A nursery. Small, immaculate, preserved with the particular heartbreak of a room that had been made ready and never used. A white crib near the window. A rocking chair angled toward it. A shelf of small things, a wooden horse, a soft bear, objects chosen by hands that had expected to place them into smaller hands in return. The curtains were drawn, but light pressed through them in thin, dusty lines, illuminating everything with the quality of something held under glass. Whitney stepped inside and sat down in the rocking chair. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the light to shift. Long enough that when she heard the footsteps stop abruptly in the doorway behind her, she was not startled. The silence that followed was a different species entirely from the silences she had grown accustomed to from Pedro Thornfield. This one had weight and heat and the specific texture of something private being violated. "Get out." His voice was low, controlled in the way that things are controlled when they are very close to not being controlled at all. Whitney did not move. His name was Edmund. She had found that much in the household records, in the entry no one had thought to remove. He lived 4 days. "I will not discuss this with you." "I know." She turned then, finally, to look at him. He stood in the doorway, that sharp face stripped of its usual careful blankness, something rawer underneath, something that looked almost like anguish before he could reassemble himself around it. "You won't discuss anything with me. You issue instructions and maintain distances and deliver sentences to walls rather than people. I am aware of your preferences, Your Grace." He crossed the room in 4 strides. "You have no right to sit in an empty room." She rose from the chair, which brought her closer to him than either of them had been prepared for. Close enough to see the line of tension in his jaw, the way his eyes, up close, were not cold at all but something far more dangerous than cold. "You told me to disappear, Pedro. I am trying to understand the house I disappeared into. This room is not part of your inventory." "No." Her voice, when it came, was quieter. "It's part of your grief. And you've left it unlocked." Something cracked open in his expression, just for a moment, just enough, before he turned and walked out without another word, leaving her alone with the wooden horse and the empty crib and the terrible, clarifying knowledge that the man she had married was not cold. He was shattered, and he had no idea she could see it. She had not gone to the riding grounds to be seen. She had gone because the morning had pressed in on her in the particular way that Ravenscroft mornings sometimes did, too quiet, too large, too full of rooms. She was still learning not to feel small inside, and because riding was the one thing that had always returned her to herself. Her mother had insisted all 3 Wilson daughters learn properly, not for social credit, but for the same reason she had insisted they learn to read maps and manage household accounts. You will need to know how to move through the world on your own terms. She had taken the gray mare from the stable without announcement and ridden out toward the northern boundary, where the estate's tenant farms began. It was there that she found the situation. 3 of the tenant farmers stood in a field just off the bridle path, their voices raised over a problem that had apparently been escalating since early morning. A drainage channel, dug without proper surveying, was flooding the boundary between 2 properties and destroying the winter crop of the man downhill. The 2 parties had ceased discussing solutions and arrived firmly at accusations. The estate steward, a man named Croft, stood to one side holding his hat and contributing nothing of use. Whitney dismounted. She spent 40 minutes in that field. She asked specific questions and listened to the specific answers. She identified the remediation the drainage channel required, proposed a temporary measure for the immediate flooding, and outlined a cost-sharing arrangement between the two farmers that acknowledged both their losses without requiring either to absorb full liability. She used the estate steward as a witness and told him to have the agreement written before nightfall. She was remounting the gray mare when she became aware of Pedro. He sat on his black horse at the edge of the tree line, far enough to suggest he had not meant to be noticed, close enough that she knew he had seen all of it. She could not read his expression at that distance. She gathered her reins and rode back toward the manor without acknowledging him. He caught up to her before she reached the stable yard. They rode in silence for a moment. Then, Croft has failed to resolve that dispute for 3 weeks. "I know," Whitney said. "I read the correspondence file." Another silence. "You read the estate correspondence files?" "You left them in the study, where I work in the mornings." She kept her eyes on the path ahead. "I assumed access was implied." He said nothing for long enough that she thought he had decided to let it rest. "Then, you handled it well." It was plainly meant as a compliment. It arrived with all the grace of a man unaccustomed to the architecture of acknowledgment, stiff, slightly off-center, delivered to the middle distance rather than to her. Whitney turned to look at him directly. "You sound surprised." His jaw tightened. "I didn't say that." "You didn't need to." She held his gaze steadily. "I am your wife, your grace. Not a favorable outcome you failed to anticipate." She looked back to the path. "But thank you. All the same." She rode ahead and left him to sit with that. She found the letters on a Friday, which felt appropriate. Fridays had always struck her as the day the week finally stopped pretending. She had not been searching for anything specific. She had been reorganizing the study's secondary cabinet, a piece of furniture Pedro clearly considered decorative, given that its contents had no discernible system. When the bundle appeared behind a false panel, she discovered entirely by accident when a misfiled ledger caused the back to shift. The letters were tied with household string rather than ribbon, the knot practical and loveless, as though whoever had placed them there had wanted them contained rather than kept. She untied them and began to read. It took her 20 minutes to understand what she was holding. Another 10 to be certain. She read the relevant passages twice, slowly, in the way she read things that required her to be sure before she allowed herself to react. The correspondence was between a physician and the estate's former solicitor, dated 4 years ago. Edmund Thornfield had not died of the fever that the official record described. He had died because a nurse, engaged without proper reference checks, had administered the wrong compound during a night when the attending physician was absent. The physician had identified the error in his private notes. The solicitor had helped contain it, redirecting the documented cause of death with the particular efficiency of men protecting men of consequence from consequences. The nurse had been quietly dismissed. The record had been sealed. And Pedro had been told only that his son's fever had progressed too quickly, that nothing more could have been done, that these things sometimes happened and could not be explained. He had believed them. He had spent 4 years believing them, carrying a grief that had been handed to him pre-assembled, pre-sealed, every inconvenient truth removed from it before delivery. Whitney set the letters down on the desk and sat very still for a long time. This was, she understood, a significant thing to hold. In other hands it might become a door, something to open at the correct moment, in the correct company, to produce a specific effect. She was not naive about her position in this marriage, about the imbalance of it, about the ways a woman in her circumstance learned to find leverage wherever the architecture allowed. She sat with the thought, examined it honestly, let it show her exactly what it was. And then she set it down, the way one sets down something that does not belong to you. Pedro's grief was not her instrument. The truth about Edmund was not a weapon. It was a wound kept open for 4 years by men who had decided their comfort outweighed his, and it deserved something better than another person deciding what to do with it for their own purposes. She retied the letters carefully. She did not replace them behind the panel. Instead, she placed them in the center of the desk where he would find them, with nothing attached, no note, no explanation, no direction. Only the truth, returned to the person it had always belonged to. She came down to dinner on Thursday to find the table set for two. Not the formal dining room, that long, echoing expanse designed to make conversation feel like a diplomatic exercise, but the smaller room off the library that Whitney had privately decided was the only room in Ravenscroft with any genuine warmth. A fire had been lit. The candles were neither too many nor too few. Someone had placed a single arrangement of late-season flowers at the center of a table with the slightly self-conscious quality of a gesture that had been considered and reconsidered before being committed to. Pedro was already seated. He rose when she entered, which he had not done before at private meals, and the formality of it in so intimate a setting produced an odd effect, like watching a man in full armor attempt to hand someone a cup of tea. Before we continue, please subscribe, likes, comments, and follow, because tomorrow I have more story for you. I thought, he stopped. Began again. I asked Mrs. Hale to arrange something less formal this evening. I see that. Whitney took her seat across from him, unfolding her napkin with the unhurried calm she had learned to use the way other women used fans. It's a good room for it. The first course arrived, and they navigated it with the careful attention of two people who had not yet established the grammar of ordinary conversation between them. She did not mention the letters. He did not mention them either, but their absence from the discussion occupied the room with a presence of its own, acknowledged in the way his jaw held a different tension than usual, in the way he looked at her twice before he spoke, as though reconsidering his approach. "Your family's estate," he said finally. "In Wiltshire. You grew up there entirely." It was such an unexpected question, so plainly unpracticed, so stripped of the ducal authority he typically used as scaffolding, that she almost smiled before she could compose herself. "Until I was 17, she said. "Then 2 years in Bath for my education. Then home again." She considered him across the candlelight. It was a small estate, nothing like Ravenscroft, but the library was exceptional. "What did you read?" Another unexpected question. She answered honestly, and he actually listened, in the way that was different from a polite performance of listening, and when she finished, he offered something in return, a single sentence about a book his mother had kept on the same shelf, and it was so brief and so unguarded that she treated it with the care it deserved and did not press further. The dinner was imperfect. The silences were still longer than the conversation. He asked one question too few and sat with too many things unsaid, and she could see the effort it cost him, this man who had organized his entire interior life around the principle of not reaching toward people, to reach even this small distance. It was not enough. Not yet. But it was a beginning, and Whitney had always known how to be patient with beginnings. She accepted the evening for precisely what it was, and let him see that she had. The rumor reached Whitney on a Wednesday, which was how she knew it had been placed deliberately. Wednesdays were Lady Hartwell's at-home days, the most reliably attended social fixture in the county, the room where information moved fastest and landed hardest. Whoever had chosen Wednesday understood the architecture of damage. Whitney filed that understanding away before she allowed herself to feel any of the rest of it. She heard it first from a woman whose name she had not yet committed to memory, delivered with the particular breathlessness of someone who considered themselves a reluctant messenger and was neither. Such a shame, they were saying. The Duke requiring an heir, and his new Duchess apparently, well, one heard things. From reliable sources. Medical things. Poor creature. The woman's eyes had that bright, careful quality of someone watching for a reaction to harvest. Whitney smiled with warm serenity and changed the subject to the county's Winter Relief Fund. She heard it twice more before the afternoon was finished. By the time she arrived at the Fenwick Musicale that Friday evening, the rumor had achieved the particular velocity of something that had found its audience. She could feel it in the room, in the slight recalibration of eyes as she entered, in the conversations that tilted almost imperceptibly away. She had been in enough rooms to know the difference between ordinary social weather and a storm with a source. She found the source within the first quarter hour. Serena Ashby stood near the pianoforte in pale gold silk, positioned with the unconscious precision of a woman who had selected her location before she arrived. Pedro stood 2 feet from her, drawn there by some gravitational force Whitney did not have enough information to name. Serena's hand rested briefly on his arm as she spoke, a gesture so natural, so apparently habitual, that its familiarity was its own message. Pedro did not remove his arm. He looked up once, found Whitney's eyes across the room, and looked away. It was a small thing. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. The kind of moment that could be explained, contextualized, attributed to distraction or discomfort or any number of innocent causes. Whitney was fair enough to know this. She was also honest enough to know that fairness did not make it hurt less. She stayed another 40 minutes. She spoke to Lady Fenwick about the education committee. She complimented the pianist sincerely and meant it. She did not look toward Pedro and Serena again, which required a specific and exhausting kind of discipline. In the carriage home, she said nothing. Pedro attempted once. The musicale was well attended, and she agreed pleasantly and returned to the window. At her chamber door, she turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made something shift in his. "Whitney." "Good night, Your Grace." Her voice was even, gentle even. "I hope you had a pleasant evening." She closed the door quietly. She did not lean against it this time. She simply stood in the center of the room and waited for herself to decide what kind of woman she intended to be in the morning. The answer arrived without much deliberation. The same kind she had always been. The kind that did not chase, did not plead, did not hand people the satisfaction of her collapse. She had given him the space to choose who he was. Whatever he chose, she would know exactly what to do with it. She wore red to the winter gala. Not the cautious red of a woman testing a color. A deep, decided crimson that announced itself without apology and required a certain kind of certainty to carry. Whitney was certain. She had been building toward this evening for 3 weeks with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who understood that the most effective arrangements are the ones that appear to have arranged themselves. The physician's assistant had not been difficult to locate. He had left Ravenscroft's employ 2 years after Edmund's death, settled in a village 40 minutes north, and carried his knowledge of that night with the uncomfortable posture of a man whose silence had cost him more than he had anticipated when he agreed to it. Whitney had written to him once, briefly, without pressure or promise. She had simply told him that the Duke deserved to know the truth about his son, and that she believed he was the kind of man who would want to be the one to tell it. He had arrived at the gala as a guest of Lord Fenwick, whose hospitality Whitney had requested with a single, carefully worded note. She did not engineer what happened next. She simply ensured the conditions were correct and trusted the truth to move on its own. She was speaking with Lady Hartwell near the east windows when she saw Pedro go still across the room, that particular stillness that was not composure but its opposite, the stillness of a man receiving something that reorganized. Everything he thought he understood. Lord Fenwick stood beside him. The physician's assistant stood beside Fenwick. Pedro listened for 4 minutes without moving. Then he turned and found Whitney's eyes across the length of the room with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the controlled blankness, not the effortful distance, but something raw and unguarded and entirely undefended. She held his gaze steadily and said nothing. This moment was his. She had no intention of stepping into it. It was Serena who stepped into it instead. She materialized at Whitney's elbow with the timing of a woman who had been waiting for an opening, her voice pitched at that precise social register, too quiet for accusation, too clear for privacy. "How industrious you've been this evening, Your Grace. Orchestrating reunions, managing introductions. One almost forgets you're a guest and not the entertainment." The nearby conversations dimmed slightly. Heads turned with the careful indirection of people who wanted to witness without appearing to. Lady Serena. Pedro's voice arrived before Whitney could respond. He crossed the room with a quietness that was somehow louder than any entrance she had witnessed him make. He stopped beside Whitney, not 2 feet from her, not the careful social distance of their early weeks, but beside her, close enough that his position itself was a declaration. His eyes did not leave Serena's face. "I believe," he said, with a precision so controlled it was almost surgical, "that you have confused my wife's competence for a performance staged for your benefit." I understand the mistake. You have always been more comfortable as the subject of a room's attention than as an observer of someone more deserving of it. A pause. I'll ask you not to address the Duchess of Ravenscroft in that manner again, in this house or any other. Serena's expression held for exactly 1 second before something behind it gave way. She left shortly after. The room redistributed itself around her absence with the smooth efficiency of a social body excising an irritant. Pedro turned to Whitney then, fully, in a room full of people, without any apparent concern for what any of them made of it. Something in his face had changed, not just tonight, but finally, irrevocably, as though the last mechanism holding a particular door closed had simply released. "You gave me the letters," he said quietly. "You found the truth, and you gave it back to me. It belonged to you. You could have used it." His voice was low, stripped of everything except the thing underneath. "Against me. For leverage. Any number of people would have." Whitney looked at him steadily. "I am not any number of people." He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, in the way he had been carefully avoiding since the first night in this marriage, and she watched him arrive, finally, at the full understanding of exactly who was standing in front of him. "No," Pedro Thornfield said quietly. "You are not." She told him on a Sunday morning. Not by design. Sundays had not yet accumulated enough history between them to carry the weight of intention. It was simply the morning it became undeniable, and Whitney had never seen the use in postponing the undeniable. She found him in the study, which had become, by a process neither of them had formally acknowledged, a room they shared. His correspondence occupied the left side of the desk. Hers occupied the right. The arrangement had arrived gradually and stayed without discussion, the way the best arrangements tend to. He looked up when she entered. He had begun doing that, looking up immediately with the specific quality of attention that meant her presence in a room registered as something other than an administrative fact. She had not told him what it meant to her, that small, unremarkable thing. She was still learning which things to say aloud and which to simply allow. She sat in the chair across from the desk, which was not her chair but had become, also without discussion, her chair. "I need to tell you something." He set down his pen, fully, without the fractional hesitation of a man deciding whether to divide his attention. He gave her all of it. "I am pregnant." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the grounds of Ravenscroft lay silver and frost-covered under a winter sky that couldn't decide between gray and blue. Whitney watched Pedro's face move through something complex and unguarded, the sequence of a man for whom this news carried more history than a single moment could hold. She saw Edmund in it. She saw the 4 years of a grief he had carried incorrectly, alone, assembled from a lie. She saw the particular fear of a person who had learned that loving something gave the world a precise location to hurt you. She let him have all of it. She did not fill the silence with reassurance or deflection. She had learned these past weeks that Pedro Thornfield needed space to arrive at himself, and that the most useful thing she could do was remain present while he did. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Stripped entirely of the ducal register, the controlled authority, the careful distance. It was simply his voice which she had heard so rarely that it still had the quality of something rare. "I don't want a successor." He looked at her directly the way he had looked at her at the gala, undefended, unmediated, entirely present. "I want our child." Whitney held his gaze and felt something in her chest complete emotion. It had begun the night she sat in the dark of her wedding chamber and made a promise to herself. She had kept it. He had paid for his words, not in cruelty, not by design, but in the slow, necessary currency of becoming someone worthy of taking them back. She looked at him across the desk they shared in the study she had claimed without permission, in the manner she had refused to disappear into, and she thought of the woman in the gilt mirror on that first morning, hollow-eyed, perfectly dressed, already decided. Ravenscroft had not changed. The corridors were the same. The portraits were the same. The frost on the grounds was the same particular shade of blue-gray it had been the morning after their wedding when she had walked them alone, learning the dimensions of her new life. But the man across from her was finally, irrevocably, facing her. And she had never disappeared at all.